Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now, because what follows does not belong to any one time. There is a civilization in Lovecraft's mythos that defies our most basic categories of life, history, and even memory. It is not evil, not monstrous in the usual sense, and yet it remains among the most unsettling creations in cosmic horror. Not because it wishes us harm, but because it simply does not care. Its motives are archival, its actions surgical, and its existence makes us question whether consciousness itself is just a temporary vessel for something older, colder, and far more calculating. This documentary investigates the great race of Yith, arguably the most alien civilization in Lovecraft's literary universe. A species not defined by form, but by its mastery of time. They do not travel through space. They overwrite minds across millennia, and when they do, the body becomes irrelevant. You are no longer you. Across the next 4 parts, we'll dissect the origins of this civilization, trace its philosophical implications, and explore how it continues to mutate in modern media, subculture, and academic thought. We'll examine its literary DNA, cultural symbolism, and the quiet terror it leaves behind, especially when viewed as a mirror to our own obsessive need to preserve information. This isn't a story about monsters hiding in the dark. It's a story about what happens when memory becomes eternal, and history refuses to let go. To understand the great race of Yith, we must begin in the final decade of Howard Phillips Lovecraft's life, when his fiction shifted noticeably from visceral monstrosities toward a colder, more intellectual mode of horror. By 1934 to 1935, when The Shadow Out of Time was drafted, Lovecraft had grown increasingly fascinated with scientific cosmology, deep history, and the unsettling implications of relativistic time. Earlier works such as The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, framed humanity as fragile before ancient gods, yet still relied on physical terror, cyclopean cities, grotesque anatomies, forbidden rituals. The Yithians represent a departure. They are not frightening because they devour bodies. They destabilize chronology itself. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft began writing them at precisely the moment when modern physics suggested time might be less fixed than previously assumed. Einstein's theories had circulated widely by the early 1930s, and even popular magazines speculated about temporal elasticity. Lovecraft, an obsessive reader of scientific journalism, recognized narrative opportunity in this intellectual climate. We must pause here to observe that Lovecraft's personal circumstances were equally formative. The early 1930s were marked by financial instability, declining health, and a growing sense that he belonged to a fading cultural order. His letters from 1933 repeatedly lament what he perceived as accelerating modernity, urbanization, immigration, technological upheaval. These anxieties did not simply produce reactionary nostalgia. They crystallized into a more abstract fear, displacement across time rather than geography. The great race embodies this dread with remarkable precision. Not invasion, but replacement. Not conquest, but substitution. When a Yithian mind enters a human host, identity becomes provisional, a temporary tenancy rather than a birthright. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's late philosophy. The true horror is not death, but irrelevance. One might compare this shift to the difference between Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, which fears unnatural creation, and Olaf Stapledon's Last and First Men, 1930. which contemplates civilizations erased by cosmic duration. Lovecraft increasingly wrote in the latter tradition. Yet, creator intent is rarely singular, and Lovecraft's notebooks suggest an overlapping set of motivations, scientific curiosity, antiquarian fascination, and what could be called archival anxiety. He reportedly outlined the premise of minds exchanged across epochs years before completing the story, indicating long incubation rather than spontaneous invention. The concept allowed him to explore three persistent obsessions: the instability of the self, the immensity of geological time, and the possibility that knowledge accumulates without mercy. Not adventure, but documentation. Not heroism, but record-keeping. The Yithians are scholars before they are conquerors, and this inversion matters. Their libraries stretch across eras. Their primary weapon is memory. In an age when universities expanded rapidly and academic specialization intensified, particularly after World War I reshaped research institutions, Lovecraft appears to have extrapolated a nightmare version of intellectual progress. What if scholarship continued long enough to detach entirely from empathy? Historical context further clarifies this trajectory. The interwar period cultivated what historians often describe as deep time consciousness, a growing public awareness that humanity occupies only a narrow slice of planetary history. Archaeological discoveries in Mesopotamia during the 1920s, alongside refined fossil dating methods, reinforced the unsettling scale of pre-human epochs. Lovecraft followed these developments closely through amateur astronomy circles and correspondence networks. According to several letters dated 1931, he delighted in reports suggesting that entire species flourished and vanished long before mammals emerged. The Great Race transforms that scientific realization into narrative architecture, a civilization migrating not across continents, but across millions of years. Compare this with H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, 1895, where temporal travel reveals evolutionary decay. Lovecraft radicalizes the premise. Evolution is not merely biological, it becomes strategic. When threatened, the Yithians simply relocate their consciousness forward in time, abandoning obsolete bodies like outdated instruments. Rhetorically, this marks Lovecraft's movement toward what scholars often call cosmic historicism, the framing of horror through layered temporalities rather than immediate shocks. The technique relies heavily on academic scaffolding, invented monographs, fabricated citations, cautious narrators adopting scholarly restraint. By the mid-1930s, Lovecraft understood that readers trusted documents more than screams. The horror emerges gradually through footnotes and corroborations, until skepticism erodes under the weight of apparent evidence. Consider the structural brilliance here. A professor recounts archival discoveries, which reference earlier records, which in turn gesture towards civilizations predating humanity. Each layer increases plausibility while simultaneously expanding dread. We might compare this to the documentary realism Bram Stoker employed in Dracula, 1897, though Lovecraft replaces Victorian immediacy with archaeological patience. The result is slower, quieter, arguably more destabilizing. Another element of creator intent deserves attention: the transformation of alienness itself. Earlier weird fiction often emphasized grotesque physiology, tentacles, scales, impossible geometries. Lovecraft does describe the Yithian cone bodies, yet the physical form quickly recedes in importance. Their defining trait is methodological intelligence. They catalog, they observe, they extract. Not predators, but researchers. This distinction anticipates later 20th century anxieties about surveillance and data accumulation, though Lovecraft could not have predicted digital archives. Still, the conceptual seed is visible, a civilization devoted entirely to information continuity. What happens when curiosity loses its ethical boundary? One rhetorical question lingers beneath the text. If knowledge grants survival, does morality become expendable? Dates matter here because they anchor speculation within intellectual history. The Shadow Out of Time was completed in 1935 and published in 1936, only 2 years before Lovecraft's death. It therefore functions almost as a philosophical testament, distilling decades of thought into a single narrative experiment. Triadically speaking, the story unites science, antiquarianism, and existential doubt. It suggests a universe governed by cycles, by displacements, by indifferent continuities. This reveals something unsettling. Lovecraft no longer required monstrous spectacle. The idea alone sufficed. As we transition forward, a deeper question emerges. If the great race reflects Lovecraft's historical moment, what older intellectual currents made such a civilization imaginable in the first place? To answer that, we must examine the cultural and philosophical traditions, some scholarly, some speculative, some deeply flawed, that prepared readers to contemplate minds unbound by time. Civilizations as radically alien as the great race of Yith do not arise in cultural vacuums. Though Lovecraft conceived the Yithians as wholly inhuman, their conceptual DNA draws from a deep reservoir of Western philosophical speculation, esoteric traditions, and colonial mythologies of lost advanced races. The great race's characteristics, immortality through memory, trans-temporal migration, and obsession with knowledge, resonate with a long lineage of metaphysical ideas, many of which had circulated in occult and philosophical subcultures by the early 20th century. To frame the Yithians as Lovecraft's unique invention without tracing these antecedents would be a critical oversight. We must instead ask, what earlier systems of thought allowed such a civilization to feel imaginable, if not entirely believable? A primary influence lies in Theosophy, the late 19th century spiritual movement founded by Helena Blavatsky. Theosophy advanced a pseudo-scholarly cosmology in which ancient root races progressed through vast epochs, each with specific psychic, spiritual, and technological traits. One of these, the Lemurians, was said to have practiced astral projection and maintained knowledge from earlier cycles of planetary life. The idea of disembodied minds traveling across time and inhabiting different forms was not foreign to this tradition. Lovecraft, who openly mocked occultism, nonetheless mined these narratives for symbolic structures. In particular, the theosophical concept of a hyper-archival ancient race aligns disturbingly well with the Yithians, though in Lovecraft's hands, spiritual evolution becomes epistemic horror. The philosophical roots run deeper. Consider the Platonic tradition, in which the soul pre-exists the body and possesses latent knowledge of cosmic forms. In the Meno, Plato argues that learning is remembering, anamnesis, a concept eerily mirrored in Peaslee's Recovered, memories of a life lived millions of years ago. Though Lovecraft was no Platonist, the idea that knowledge precedes and survives the body resonates strongly with Yithian methodology. Where Plato finds transcendence, however, Lovecraft finds trauma. The Yithian archive is not enlightenment, but burden, a weight of memory that the human mind cannot carry without psychological rupture. Another potent antecedent lies in Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence, formulated in the late 19th century and circulating widely in Lovecraft's intellectual milieu. The notion that all events repeat eternally in an infinite loop introduces a vision of time that is cyclical, deterministic, and inescapable. Lovecraft's universe, particularly in The Shadow Out of Time, reflects a similarly merciless temporality. The Ythians' ability to flee forward in time is not a form of progress, but a grim adaptation to entropy. They are not masters of fate, but prisoners of recursion. If anything, Nietzsche's vision is too human for Lovecraft. Where Nietzsche offers heroic affirmation, Lovecraft offers only archival resignation. We must also consider the influence of Orientalist archaeology, the popular 19th and early 20th century European obsession with recovering lost civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. This period gave rise to the belief that advanced societies had existed long before recorded history, now buried beneath sand, stone, and ice. Such narratives often included implicit racial hierarchies, portraying these civilizations as precursors to modern man rather than independently complex cultures. Lovecraft, steeped in both racist ideology and antiquarian fascination, internalized this framework but twisted it. The great race is not a noble ancestor or wise forerunner. It is utterly other, not our beginning, but our negation. This reversal is critical. Lovecraft replaces inherited nostalgia with metaphysical estrangement. The ruins do not explain us. They erase us. The Ythians also echo a specific philosophical anxiety emergent in 19th century German idealism. The question of whether the mind constructs reality or merely receives it. Kant's categories of perception, Fichte's I, and Hegel's dialectics all hinge on the problem of knowing. Lovecraft radicalizes this concern. The Ythians do not merely ask how one knows, they forcibly exchange minds to gather knowledge firsthand, across species and epochs. Their method dissolves any boundary between subject and object, observer and observed. The result is not clarity, but collapse. Peasley's crisis is not that he saw too much, but that he became something else while seeing. Epistemology here turns violent. A subtler but important influence comes from early 20th century science fiction, especially writers like Olaf Stapledon and J.H. Rosny Aine. Stapledon's Last and First Men, on 1930, proposed a 2 billion year history of human evolution, with psychic abilities and collective memory appearing in later stages. Rosny's L'amour de la terre, 1910, depicted a dying Earth populated by metal-bodied intelligences. Lovecraft read these authors, and while his tone was more pessimistic, their temporal imagination, the idea that consciousness could survive in unfamiliar vessels across vast epochs, clearly prefigures the Ythians. The difference lies in the effect. Where Rosny and Stapledon imagine wonder or melancholy, Lovecraft instills dread, not awe, but estrangement. It is tempting to reduce these antecedents into a simple genealogy of influence, but such a model misses a crucial point. Lovecraft did not synthesize these traditions into harmonious vision. He corrupted them. Each tradition offered a path to transcendence, spiritual evolution, philosophical certainty, ancestral greatness. But Lovecraft subverted them into horror. Not transformation, but disintegration. Not memory as legacy, but memory as invasion. Not X, but Y. The Ythians are what happens when the archive consumes the archivist, when knowing becomes a kind of colonization. By drawing from these philosophical and cultural currents, Lovecraft crafted a civilization whose very logic denies anthropocentric meaning. The Yithians are not just post-human, they are post-narrative. Their society does not evolve in linear time, but loops through borrowed vessels, displaced geographies, and vast epochs of observation. This prepares us for the next layer of analysis, the Yithians' linguistic and symbolic architecture, which does not merely describe their worldview, it enacts it. To understand how alien their culture truly is, we must examine how they speak, record, and remember. The name Yith appears only a handful of times in Lovecraft's work, and yet it anchors one of his most sophisticated world-building efforts. This sparsity is not an oversight, but a strategy. Unlike entities such as Cthulhu or Azathoth, whose names evoke guttural unease or chaos, the term Yith functions as a cipher. It neither signals monstrosity nor connotes ancient grandeur. Its monosyllabic form, ending in a hard consonant, resists easy categorization. It is sterile, abstract, and eerily neutral. This lexical neutrality mirrors the race's defining trait. A detachment so complete, it dissolves the usual associations between name, form, and intent. One might compare it to a file name in a digital archive, designed not to evoke, but to store. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's symbolic design. The most alien civilization in his mythos is the one whose name refuses to perform theatrics. Consider the phonetic structure. Yith contains no sibilance, no elongation, no rhythm. It is not seductive like Nyarlathotep, nor guttural like Shub-Niggurath. It offers no syllabic flourishes, no suggestion of language evolution. Linguistically, it behaves more like a placeholder, a designated symbol within a closed system. This lends the great race a conceptual purity. They are not monsters, but information objects. Their civilization does not transmit culture through song or story, but through encoded storage. When Lovecraft introduces their vast underground library, the emphasis is not on ornamentation, but durability. The texts are preserved in strange media, impervious to time, designed not for aesthetic pleasure, but for recall. Their language, we are told, is translatable, but not intuitive. One must learn to think like them before one can speak like them. This brings us to the symbolic core, language as architecture. In the shadow out of time, the Yithian language is not merely a tool for communication. It is a totalizing system of data encoding, reference indexing, and historical preservation. The text does not dwell on phonemes or grammar, but focuses on function. The language is designed to endure across geological ages and biological species. This is not human speech. It is language, divorced from emotion, stripped of ambiguity, optimized for recall. The Yithians do not use metaphor. They do not engage in poetry. Their words are binding protocols, closer to machine logic than literary expression. If Cthulhu's cultists chant to summon, the Yithians record to survive. We must pause here. This inversion matters. Lovecraft reimagines language not as expression, but as containment. The very act of naming in Yithian culture is suspect. No Yithian individual is ever named. There are no characters among them, only roles. Archivists, scientists, mind exchangers. The civilization lacks heroes, myths, or moral exemplars. Its only consistent narrative is preservation. In this sense, their linguistic minimalism becomes a philosophical statement. Identity is not essential, but temporary. One does not say, "I am Yithian," because "I" implies continuity. The Yithian self is a relay node for information, and language reflects this condition. Compare this with the Necronomicon, whose passages often suggest madness through excess, cascading descriptors, contradictory warnings, occult riddles. Yithian records, by contrast, suppress style in favor of structural fidelity. This stark divergence illustrates Lovecraft's dual treatment of forbidden knowledge. Some texts destroy through overwhelming revelation, others through sterile accumulation. The symbolic language of the Yithians also pervades the story's structure. The shadow out of time adopts the form of an academic confession, complete with footnotes, time-stamped letters, and corroborating evidence. This rhetorical decision parallels the Yithian epistemology. Knowledge must be verified, cited, layered. Peaslee, the narrator, becomes a vessel for their historiographical method. His dreams, once chaotic, become increasingly indexed. He maps the past not through emotion, but through architectural schematics, astronomical coordinates, and stratigraphic records. The shift in tone from personal fear to systemic inquiry is itself a linguistic transformation. By the final chapters, Peaslee no longer uses language to describe his panic. He uses it to recreate a library. This evolution is not a return to selfhood. It is a Yithian infection. Meta-commentary is warranted here. The story's language grows more alien as the plot advances, not because the vocabulary becomes unfamiliar, but because the function of language changes. Sentences lengthen, digressions multiply, evidence replaces reflection. Lovecraft effectively imitates Yithian language within English prose. It is not the words themselves that alienate, but their purpose. We do not read to feel, we read to catalog. This is what makes the Yithian archive so disturbing. It co-opts our cognitive habits. Even the reader becomes complicit. Each paragraph mimics a data entry. Each revelation arrives not as emotional climax, but as footnoted confirmation. The implications extend beyond fiction. Lovecraft anticipates a world in which language becomes synonymous with data, where speech is encoded, indexed, and retrievable but not lived. One might draw comparison to the evolution of digital metadata, where the act of naming no longer invokes but locates. In modern archival theory, the shift from narrative to database mirrors Yithian logic. Their civilization does not tell stories, it preserves states. It does not remember in the human sense, it restores. This symbolic framework reinforces the deeper horror of the Yithians. Their culture is not unknowable because it is irrational, but because it is over-rationalized. They have removed uncertainty from communication. They have replaced dialogue with statement, not ambiguity, but over-clarity, and in doing so, they become unrelatable. Their symbolic world is closed, sealed not by mystery, but by completion. As we turn to the next dimension of this civilization, the myths they construct, and the authenticity they simulate, we must ask, what happens when a species capable of perfect symbolic transmission decides to manufacture a history that was never theirs to begin with? Lovecraft's portrayal of the great race of Yith is not merely a product of imaginative world-building. It is an exercise in narrative simulation so precise it mimics the mechanisms of historical documentation. In the shadow out of time, myth and history are indistinguishable, not because they blur, but because Lovecraft constructs his fiction to resemble the very methodologies used to authenticate reality. Academic citations, archaeological corroboration, eyewitness testimony, and recovered manuscripts. This creates a metafictional tension. The more rigorously the narrative adheres to scholarly realism, the more deeply it destabilizes our sense of what can be trusted. Lovecraft does not fabricate a myth. He forges a document about a myth that might be true, and in doing so, he implicates the reader as participant in its authentication. The Ythians themselves are myth-makers, but unlike human cultures, which use myth to explain chaos, the great race uses narrative to establish continuity across vast stretches of time. Their records, as described in the text, extend millions of years backward and forward, chronicling not only their own civilization, but those they have inhabited, studied, and overwritten. This myth-building is not poetic. It is systemic. The Ythians construct a myth not of origin, but of observation. Their version of history is totalizing, impersonal, and so exhaustive that it erases the lived experience of its subjects. Consider this carefully. The mythos they build is not about themselves, but about everything. The Ythian archive is not a story. It is a prison of perfect memory. This presents a significant departure from traditional mythopoeia in literature, where Tolkien built Middle-earth to reflect archetypes, morality, and linguistic evolution. Lovecraft's mythos, especially in the case of the Ythians, resists allegory entirely. There is no moral structure to their history, no heroic lineage, no cultural purpose beyond preservation. The Ythian civilization does not explain the cosmos in human terms. It maps it in alien ones. Their myths have no deities, no origin story, no end. Instead, they maintain data about past and future species, geological events, and star migrations. The result is unsettling. Their mythos does not help the individual live with mystery. It seeks to eliminate mystery altogether. What makes this myth-building feel authentic, both within and beyond the narrative, is Lovecraft's calculated use of epistemic layering. The protagonist, Professor Peaslee, gradually uncovers fragments of the Ythian myth through dreams, recovered memories, and cross-referenced academic texts. These are then verified by a climactic archaeological expedition that reveals physical evidence matching those visions: an underground city, preserved carvings, and non-human artifacts. This structure mimics the progression of real historical research: hypothesis, data gathering, pattern recognition, material proof. It's not the story itself that persuades, it's the method. And here, Lovecraft deploys his most insidious technique. He presents fiction using the same rhetorical scaffolding we associate with truth. The Ythians' own myth-building further reinforces this effect. They do not simply record, they interpret, they project, they simulate. According to the narrative, they use their mind exchange technology to extract knowledge from countless civilizations, then reconstruct those worlds in archival form. This transforms myth into artifact. A culture's folklore, dreams, and metaphysical systems are encoded in tablets and stored in geometric vaults. What began as symbolic becomes literal. In this process, narrative authenticity is severed from cultural context. The Ythians preserve stories, but not storytellers. Meaning is retained, without memory. Not a tradition, but a reconstruction. This leads to an important implication. The Ythian mythos is not corrupted by time, but by its own precision. By preserving every version of every account, they render all narratives equally plausible, and therefore equally meaningless. This is myth without hierarchy, without revelation, without closure. Their records do not resolve uncertainty. They multiply it. One might compare this to Borges's Library of Babel, where every book exists, including all possible errors. The Ythian library is not so different. It is exhaustive to the point of epistemic collapse. If all myths are stored, how can anyone retain significance? Lovecraft deepens this thematic arc through narrative voice. Peaslee's tone shifts from skepticism to resignation, not because he embraces the Ythians' truth, but because he cannot dismiss it. The archaeological confirmation at the story's end operates like a final footnote, closing the argument rather than the plot. This is not resolution. It is submission to the archive. And in that submission, Lovecraft achieves a rare effect, myth-building as anti-narrative. The more complete the story, the less the human mind can bear it. There is a further irony embedded here. While the Yithians meticulously archive every civilization they encounter, their own origin remains obscure. The story offers no explanation for where they came from, why they developed this capacity for mental migration, or what they ultimately hope to achieve. Their mythos is perfect in every direction but inward. This is a masterstroke. Lovecraft withholds the very narrative that would humanize them. Not ignorance, but unknowability. Not X, but Y. The Yithians become believable not because we understand them, but because they are too systematized to be fake. This is narrative authenticity inverted. The enduring power of the Yithian myth lies in its methodological realism. Lovecraft's manipulation of academic tone, citation logic, and archaeological discourse creates a structure so convincing that it bypasses the need for emotional persuasion. It feels real because it sounds real. But what we're hearing is a story about a species that builds myths not to believe in, but to dominate with. They do not dream, they archive. We must shift focus from the Yithians' external constructions to their internal principles. What does it mean to build a civilization on the idea that memory, not biology, not morality, is the only continuity that matters? What kind of philosophy emerges when the self is merely the shell for recording systems? Let us now examine the nature and themes of the most alien civilization Lovecraft ever imagined. If Lovecraft's mythos can be said to orbit any gravitational center, it is the persistent annihilation of anthropocentric meaning. With the great race of Yith, this philosophical core finds one of its most refined and disquieting expressions. There, civilization does not simply dwarf humanity in technological scale or temporal reach. It destabilizes the very concepts through which humans anchor reality. In the Yithian worldview, individuality is transitory, progress is irrelevant, and time is not linear but migratory. The horror they embody is not cruelty, but indifference. This detachment gives shape to three foundational philosophical themes in Lovecraft's later work: insignificance, entropy, and dream reality collapse. Each intersects with the Yithians in ways that erase the self while preserving the archive, an epistemological tension that haunts the shadow out of time from first page to last. Let us begin with insignificance, not as an emotional reaction, but as a cosmic condition. The Yithians view humanity not as primitive, but as transient. There is no malice in their observations, only measurement. The protagonist, Nathaniel Peaslee, becomes a subject in their study not because he is special, but because he is statistically viable. A mind of the requisite type, Lovecraft's phrasing is cold, clinical, exacting. His consciousness is swapped, stored, and later returned with as little ceremony as one might lend to loaning a book. This is not mere of existential dread. It is ontological removal. The self becomes incidental, a node in a larger data structure. Compared to the elder things who built cities from alien stone, or the Shoggoths who writhe in instinctual revolt, the Yithians offer no visible horror, only the quiet certainty that your mind was never essential to begin with. This sense of insignificance is sharpened by entropy, not simply as decay, but as the inevitable limit of all systems, including civilizations. The Yithians, despite their vast knowledge, do not prevent their extinction. They only postpone it. When threatened by the rise of the hideous winged, star-headed, half-polypus invaders, Lovecraft's flying polyps, they do not resist. They abandon their bodies and leap forward in time, seeking a more durable host species. This is not heroism, it is archival triage. Their survival strategy acknowledges that every material culture eventually fails. No wall lasts. No monument holds. Not even the mind remains fixed. The only continuity that matters is information migration, and even that is temporary. The Yithians are not exempt from entropy. They are archivists racing against it. Their libraries are built not in defiance of decay, but in full acknowledgement of it. The terror here is subtle. Even perfect knowledge cannot outlast a collapsing cosmos. We must pause here to reflect on a crucial paradox. The Yithians escape entropy not by preserving matter, but by abandoning it. They survive as mimetic patterns, not in the evolutionary sense, but in the archival one. They treat the body as a temporary storage shell, the mind as a replicable format. This recalls themes in modern digital philosophy, particularly in discussions of post-human consciousness. Yet Lovecraft arrives at this over 70 years earlier, and he frames it not as transcendence, but dislocation. When Peaslee's mind is forcibly displaced, he does not evolve, he shatters. The horror lies not in what the Yithians do, but in what their method reveals, that consciousness is not sovereign, but portable, not unique, but replaceable. The third core theme, dream-reality collapse, infuses the shadow out of time with its peculiar unease. Peaslee's experiences in the Yithian city begin as dreams, regress into memory, and finally cohere as historical fact. Lovecraft deliberately withholds certainty. Are these delusions, psychic hauntings, or temporal truths? The distinction erodes across the narrative. This aligns with Lovecraft's broader tendency to use dreams not as escapism, but as epistemic infection. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, the dream world mirrors subconscious desire. In the shadow out of time, dream becomes a mechanism for historical data transfer. The Yithians invade not through ships or sigils, but through mental presence that first mimics sleep, then overwrites waking life. As Peaslee confesses, "What I learned was no dream, but real knowledge passed across gulfs of time and mind." The reader is left with a destabilizing proposition. What we call dreaming may be the medium of deepest truth. What we dismiss as unreality may in fact be historical relay. The fusion of these three concepts, insignificance, entropy, and dream reality, creates a philosophical structure in which the Yithians thrive and humanity flounders. We are unfit not because we lack technology, but because we cling to meaning. The Yithians have no myths of identity, no philosophies of purpose. They do not believe, they record. Their civilization is horrifying precisely because it has outgrown the need for narrative justification. In Lovecraft's hands, this becomes a terrifying inversion. Not chaos without meaning, but order without mercy. And yet the most disturbing implication may be this: the Yithians are not antagonists. They do not seek dominion, vengeance, or salvation. They are researchers. They are us, but perfected into something we can no longer recognize. They embody what human reason might become when stripped of compassion, mortality, and origin. In this sense, they represent the final boundary of cosmic horror, not the monstrous other, but the cold future of the self. As we proceed, we must now examine the agents behind these themes: the Yithians themselves, their biological vessels, and the unspoken opposites that haunt their timeline. What are these entities, truly? What shapes do they wear? And why does their civilization require displacement, not defense? Let us now turn to the beings themselves and the fragile shells they so easily discard. In Lovecraft's corpus, alien civilizations often function as metaphysical mirrors, entities that reflect the limits of human comprehension through exaggerated form, function, or intent. The great race of Yith, by contrast, subverts this framework entirely. Their alienness does not reside in monstrous anatomy or unspeakable rituals, but in their sheer methodological detachment. Yet to understand the great race in isolation would be a mistake. Their identity emerges only in contrast to other entities, those they displace, those they study, and those that pursue them. It is within this triangulation that the most alien aspects of their civilization become visible. The cone-shaped bodies they inhabit, the flying polyps they flee, and the other entities of Lovecraft's mythos, such as the Elder Things and Dreamland's denizens, each frame the Yithian's behavior as less monstrous, but more existentially threatening. Let us begin with the most immediate vessels of Yithian presence, the cone-shaped beings of prehistoric Earth. These towering five-limbed organisms are described in clinical detail. Thick, rubbery skin, multiple appendages, sensory organs arranged radially. But despite their bizarre appearance, Lovecraft takes care to emphasize that their utility, not their horror, is what matters. The Yithians did not design these bodies. They inhabited them. In a sense, the bodies are archaeological tools, chosen for their stability, not identity. There is no cultural attachment to form. The being that speaks through the cone does not belong to it. Here we encounter a foundational tenet of Yithian philosophy. Biology is incidental. What matters is memory. The host is nothing more than scaffolding for thought. Compare this with the Elder Things introduced in At the Mountains of Madness. They too are rational, scientific, and non-human. Yet their attachment to form, art, and biology contrasts sharply with the Yithians' functional indifference. The Elder Things design cities, engage in creative expression, and even produce servitor races like the Shoggoths. Their downfall is tied to a lapse in control, a failure to account for biological rebellion. The Yithians, by contrast, avoid this risk altogether. They do not evolve with a body. They evacuate it when danger arises. Their civilization is not organic. It is parasitic in the most abstract sense, not of flesh, but of time. This method becomes critical in light of their great nemesis, the flying polyps. These entities, unnamed in ancient myth and scarcely understood even by the Yithians, represent a counterforce, not merely in power, but in principle. Where the Yithians are archivists, the polyps are anarchic. Where the Yithians catalog, the polyps destroy. Described as invisible, intangible, yet capable of extraordinary violence, the polyps embody a kind of chaotic intelligence, antithetical to the structured memory systems of the Yithians. Their eventual uprising, millions of years after Earth becomes their shared domain, forces the great race to abandon their cone-shaped hosts and flee forward in time. Importantly, they do not defeat the polyps. They simply displace themselves again. The polyps are not an evil to be vanquished, but an entropy to be avoided. This relationship, Yithian as migratory mind, polyp as elemental force, places the two at opposite poles of Lovecraft's philosophical spectrum. One is the horror of total order, the other of absolute chaos. And yet, they are equally alien. The Yithians horrify not because they destroy, but because they do not care. The polyps horrify because they do not stop. This duality reflects Lovecraft's broader vision. Civilization exists only as a temporary balance between two voids. We must also briefly consider the Dreamland's entities, especially those encountered in the Dream Quest of unknown Kadath. Here, Lovecraft plays with the notion of imagined realities possessing their own ontological weight. Beings like Nyarlathotep or the Zoogs function not just as dream figures, but as expressions of subconscious forces. Unlike the Yithians, who exist in waking history, the Dreamland's creatures operate through desire, fear, and narrative logic. The contrast is instructive. Dreamland's entities terrify by destabilizing internal coherence, what you believe about yourself, what you remember desiring. The Yithians destabilize external continuity, who you were when you lived, what body you belong to. Both unravel selfhood, but from opposite directions. Not dream into madness, but memory into vacancy. Even more distant are entities like Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth, whose appearances in Lovecraft's work frame the ultimate limits of reality. The blind idiot god at the center of chaos, the all-in-one gatekeeper beyond time. While the Yithians do not directly interact with these outer forces, their existence raises a disturbing question. If Yog-Sothoth sees all of time as one, are the Yithians simply fragments inside its perception? Is their entire method, migration through time, merely movement within a prison whose walls they cannot perceive? Lovecraft never answers. The Yithians are vast, but not infinite. They are masters of recorded time, not of ultimate time. Meta-commentary is necessary here. Lovecraft does not rank these entities according to power or danger. He measures them by their relationship to human epistemology. The Yithians violate our sense of selfhood. The polyps violate our sense of causality. The outer gods violate being itself. Together, they construct a layered cosmos in which humanity is unmoored not by monsters, but by systems too large to comprehend. To conclude, the great race of Yith appears restrained in comparison to Lovecraft's more chaotic deities. But this restraint is deceptive. They are not the most powerful entities in the mythos, but they may be the most alien because their threat is not to the body or the world, but to the concept of self. They reveal what happens when a civilization chooses information over identity and survival over form. As we turn next to humanity's direct interactions with this civilization, the mind swaps, the psychological aftermaths, the epistemic shocks, we must ask, what does it mean to be studied by something that remembers you better than you remember yourself? In Lovecraft's fiction, madness is never arbitrary. It is the inevitable cost of proximity to truths the human mind was never shaped to bear. With the great race of Yith, this collapse of sanity emerges not through grotesque visual horror or incomprehensible language, but through a much quieter and far more invasive violation, the theft of selfhood. Unlike other cosmic entities that act from hostility or instinct, the Yithians swap minds with human beings as part of their academic method. It is a process devoid of cruelty and utterly lacking in empathy, and that is precisely what makes it horrifying. The human psyche does not fracture under torture or isolation. It disintegrates beneath the weight of having been replaced, quietly, efficiently, and with clinical justification. Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee, the central figure in The Shadow Out of Time, becomes the primary case study for this dynamic. During a lecture in 1908, he collapses mid-sentence and wakes with no memory of the preceding 5 years. His family and colleagues report a total transformation. His handwriting changes, his tastes invert, His knowledge expands into arcane and untraceable fields. Yet the true horror begins only after he returns to normal. Over time, Peaslee is afflicted with intrusive dreams of cyclopean libraries, cone-shaped bodies, and geometric cities beneath a dead sun. These are not delusions. They are residual memories of his time as a vessel for a Yithian mind. The process reverses, but the damage lingers. Memory and identity no longer align. The self becomes palimpsest. This experience exemplifies a core theme in Lovecraftian horror: madness as epistemological collapse. The issue is not merely that Peaslee remembers alien landscapes. It is that these memories are too coherent, too structured, too verifiable. The dreams follow no symbolic logic. They match architectural realities later confirmed by an archaeological expedition. Herein lies the paradox. If the delusion proves real, what becomes of sanity? The classic model of psychosis relies on contradiction between perception and reality. Lovecraft undermines this entirely. The problem is not hallucination, it's confirmation. What the mind cannot integrate is not unreality, but a second reality with equal claim to truth. We must pause to consider what the Yithians themselves represent in this dynamic. They do not seek to torment, manipulate, or possess. They simply study. Their process is described with unnerving neutrality. A Yithian mind selects a human counterpart, initiates the time-spanning exchange, and stores the borrowed consciousness in its library for the duration of research. When the study concludes, the swap is reversed. This framing removes all moral context. There is no violation in Yithian ethics, only data retrieval. Madness, from their perspective, is a human malfunction, not a consequence. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft imagines a universe in which trauma is not inflicted. It is incurred by contact with systems too vast to recognize our fragility. Importantly, this experience is not unique to Peaslee. The story implies many historical cases of unexplained personality shifts, sudden erudition, or inexplicable disappearances may be symptoms of Yithian exchange. Lovecraft introduces a chilling suggestion that others have lived as hosts and never recovered. Their madness, institutionalization, or suicide are not aberrations. They are statistical outcomes. One could imagine a taxonomy of madness in the Lovecraftian universe, with the Peaslee case forming a successful outcome: partial recovery, retained memory, and eventual corroboration. But for every Peaslee, there are likely countless others who collapse beneath the weight of borrowed identity. This leads to a deeper philosophical implication. Madness is the only rational response to cosmic realism. In confronting the Yithians, the human mind encounters a species for whom time, body, and memory are modular components. This collapses every foundational assumption of personal identity. The Cartesian, "I think therefore I am," fails entirely. The Yithians prove that one can think without being, remember without living, inhabit without originating. The terror is not of being observed, but of having one's mind proven unnecessary. There is also a structural irony embedded within the narrative. Peaslee, a professor of political economy, embodies Enlightenment rationality. His mental faculties are highly developed, his worldview anchored in academic skepticism. Yet it is precisely this rational openness, his ability to question, analyze, and document, that allows the Yithian presence to persist within him. His intellectual tools become the channels through which the alien archive flows. In this sense, his madness is not a breakdown, but a continuity. He does not lose his mind. He expands it until it fractures. Lovecraft reflects this process in the narrative form itself. The story unfolds not as emotional testimony, but as a research document, complete with historical timelines, secondary sources, and a final expedition. This mimics the Yithian mode of knowledge. Even Peasley's madness is documented, indexed, observed. There is no catharsis, no dramatic confrontation. The horror is bureaucratic. A life interrupted, filed, and quietly returned. Damaged, but intact. Meta-commentary becomes inescapable. The Shadow Out of Time is not a story about madness in the traditional sense. It is a story about a mind rendered obsolete by contact with a higher archival logic. Madness here is not a failure. It is the default result of knowing what must not be known, that consciousness is transportable, that identity is not singular, and that the self can be studied more effectively by something that has no interest in preserving it. The nature of forbidden knowledge and its cumulative effects. We must ask what remains after memory has been co-opted, identity has been returned, and madness has proven itself rational. If the mind survives the Yithian archive, what becomes of truth itself? In the Shadow Out of Time, knowledge does not liberate, it corrodes. The great race of Yith offers no dark grimoire, no cursed phrase, no ritual gone awry. Their gift is far more insidious, complete, verifiable, systematized understanding, and it is this that undoes the mind. Lovecraft's most alien civilization does not reveal ancient truths, they reveal too many of them. Forbidden knowledge in this context is not hidden because it is inaccessible, but because the mind is unsuited to hold it. The collapse that follows is not moral, emotional, or physical. It is epistemic. The frame of knowing itself buckles beneath the weight of its own precision. In this final thematic core of Part 2, we confront a civilization whose horror lies not in secrecy, but in disclosure. To begin, we must ask, what qualifies as forbidden in a world governed by impersonal science? In traditional horror, the forbidden is cloaked in taboo, demonic names, esoteric symbols, unknowable dimensions. But the Yithians operate entirely without mysticism. Their knowledge is historical, biological, astronomical. It can be measured, cross-referenced, mapped. The horror emerges not from the content, but from the scale and implication. When Peasley begins to recall the knowledge passed to him during his time in a Yithian body, he does not awaken with visions of monsters. He remembers timelines, technologies, and future civilizations. What drives him to the brink is not the alien, it is the clarity. This precision becomes the vector of collapse. As Peasley reconstructs fragments of Yithian records, he begins to doubt not the memories, but his ability to process them. The implication, he writes, was of a mind trained for centuries to handle and store enormous complexes of information beyond all human comprehension. The human brain is not built to handle this, but the information persists, seeking expression. He dreams in symbols he should not know, draws maps of cities buried under aeons of strata, and speaks extinct languages with no access to source. This knowledge cannot be forgotten. It leaks. Here, Lovecraft introduces a uniquely modern horror, the mind as a compromised archive. Forbidden knowledge does not destroy the individual by force. It embeds within the cognitive structure and erodes the boundary between subject and object. Peasley is no longer a scholar studying time. He is a carrier of time itself. The Yithians did not show him their knowledge. They installed it. This distinction is not poetic. It is structural. Not insight, but infection. This leads to the broader philosophical theme, epistemic collapse. the breakdown of the systems by which one understands, evaluates, and retains meaning. In Lovecraft's mythos, this occurs when the scaffolding of rationality encounters scales or logics it cannot resolve. The Yithian's knowledge doesn't conflict with human science. It overlaps it, but at exponential depth. What collapses is not a belief system, but the confidence in one's own cognitive frame. The self becomes unable to trust itself. And since the knowledge is factual, there is no escape through disbelief. This is not a dream one can wake from. It is memory that won't dislodge. We must pause here to reflect on a recurring motif in Lovecraft. The archival document as transmitter of horror. In earlier works, such as The Call of Cthulhu, this takes the form of cult records, ancient glyphs, or dead languages. But with the Yithians, the medium is rational and academic. Journal entries, expedition logs, architectural blueprints. The form of truth is familiar. This creates a chilling reversal. The more credible the documentation, the more fatal the knowledge it contains. Epistemic collapse is not triggered by the irrational. It is triggered by too much structured reason. The manuscript Peaslee ultimately leaves behind becomes a kind of epistemological trap. It invites replication. A future reader, perhaps a scholar, perhaps a student, may trace the same pattern, reach the same conclusion, and find themselves trapped within a loop of recognition. The knowledge itself is recursive. Once known, it cannot be unknown. Once suspected, it demands verification. This is the true curse of Yithian knowledge. It is always waiting to be confirmed. In this regard, the shadow. Out of time diverges from apocalyptic tropes. The world is not destroyed. The stars do not align. No tentacled god rises from the depths. Instead, a single mind is overwritten, returned, and then left to reconcile the irreconcilable. The horror is internalized. The apocalypse occurs not in the sky, but in cognition. We must consider the ethical silence at the core of this exchange. The Yithians offer no explanation, no apology, no justification. They seek knowledge, and in doing so, they dismantle the very idea that knowledge is neutral. Their archive is not benevolent. It is total. The cost of accessing it is not madness in the sense of emotional breakdown. It is loss of interpretive authority. The human no longer owns his own understanding. This is perhaps Lovecraft's most radical proposition. The idea that knowledge, if vast enough, will not empower, but erase. The mind will not expand. It will be empty. This is not a cautionary tale about forbidden doors. It is about what happens when you open the right door and find the hallway never ends. As we enter the literary manifestations of this philosophical structure, we must shift our lens from abstraction to text. How, precisely, does Lovecraft enact these themes in narrative form? What does the story do to simulate this collapse? And what happens when fiction becomes indistinguishable from recovered memory? Let us now examine the literary footprints left behind by the most alien civilization ever imagined. The great race of Yith first appears in full conceptual form in The Shadow Out of Time, written 1934 to 1935, published posthumously in 1936. But traces of its design and the ideas it embodies can be detected in earlier texts. Lovecraft rarely reused creatures in precise form. Instead, he refined thematic patterns across stories, building toward the Yithians as the culmination of a philosophical and narrative experiment. In this sense, the great race does not simply debut. They emerge, fully realized only when the necessary mythic architecture is in place. By tracing their intertextual evolution, we uncover a quiet genealogy of epistemic horror, stretching from vague visions of lost time to an entire civilization that colonizes the very idea of memory. The most direct ancestor of the Yithians can be found in The Nameless City, 1921, an early tale where the narrator uncovers ancient ruins in the Arabian desert that predate human history. There he encounters inscriptions, bas-reliefs, and hieroglyphs that tell of a race with inhuman physiognomy and a culture based on dreams, memory, and spiritual travel. Though unnamed and less defined, this race bears clear thematic resemblance to the Yithians. They are archivists of forgotten epochs, whose legacy is embedded in architecture that functions more like narrative than shelter. The story's final line, "That is not dead, which can eternal lie," would later become foundational to the Cthulhu Mythos. But it also introduces an idea more subtle, that knowledge buried in ruins is not safely dead, but sleeping. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, Lovecraft experiments more directly with bodily displacement and the trauma of epistemic intrusion. Here, the mygo, fungoid extraterrestrials from Yugoth, harvest human brains and place them in metallic cylinders for transport across space. Though biologically distinct from the Yithians, the mygo represent a critical intermediary, an entity that treats the human mind as a unit of information. Notably, the process is described with clinical neutrality. The horror is not that the brain is stolen, but that the being who performs the act sees no ethical conflict in doing so. This ethical indifference anticipates the Yithians' own behavior and the notion that identity can be stored, retrieved, and reinserted without damage, except, of course, to the self. By the time Lovecraft writes At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, he has developed a fully geological vision of history. The story details an Antarctic expedition's discovery of an ancient alien city and the ruined culture of the Elder Things. These beings, though now extinct, built vast cities and controlled the evolution of life on Earth through the creation of the Shoggoths. Importantly, the Elder Things are not malevolent. They are ancient and tired. Their architecture tells their story. Their science exceeds ours. Their demise was not theatrical, but inevitable. The Yithians, introduced a few years later, reflect a similar tone: age without emotion, survival without conquest. But unlike the Elder Things, the Yithians do not perish. They evacuate forward, abandoning the failing present for a more viable future. Here, Lovecraft introduces something new: temporal migration as narrative tool. In The Shadow Out of Time, the Yithians are finally rendered in full. The story uses an academic memoir structure, part confession, part scientific report, to narrate the experiences of Professor Peaslee, who becomes the unwilling host of a Yithian consciousness. The body is borrowed, the mind is stored. The story structure itself mimics the epistemic trauma of the protagonist, first uncertain, then flooded with detail, finally overwhelmed by verification. This recursive form matches the Yithians' own method. They do not announce themselves, they confirm themselves. As Peaslee writes, "I shivered at the mysteries I had touched, at the revelations that had come to me in dreams." The Yithians do not whisper or warn, they install. Metastructurally, The Shadow Out of Time functions as a narrative echo chamber. Its revelations loop. Dream leads to memory. Memory leads to manuscript. Manuscript leads to archaeological evidence. And finally, evidence closes the circle, collapsing doubt into fact. This recursive confirmation mirrors the way the Yithians themselves experience history, not linearly, but archivally. The story's use of layered documentation, letters, expedition logs, academic citations, aligns with the Yithians' own compulsive preservation habits. In this sense, the story is not only about them, it performs them. Intertextually, the Yithians thus function as the endpoint of several threads: the ruined pre-human race from the nameless city, the brain-stealing archivists of Whisperer in Darkness, and the tragic survivors of Mountains of Madness. But they are also Lovecraft's most abstract monster, one whose power lies not in what they do, but in what they represent. They do not roar or demand. They overwrite. They replace story with structure. They replace memory with record. And they leave behind no trace of emotional intent, only verification. As we move forward into the case studies, we must now examine this narrative in full focus. In the next section, we will return to the shadow out of time, not as background or emergence, but as the central literary document of the Yithian myth. What does it reveal? And more importantly, what does it deliberately refuse to resolve? Among Lovecraft's late works, The Shadow Out of Time, 1934 to 1935, stands not only as the definitive portrayal of the great race of Yith, but also as his most structurally ambitious meditation on time, memory, and identity. It functions simultaneously as a psychological case study, a speculative history, and a metafictional simulation of cognitive collapse. Unlike other tales of cosmic horror that rely on climax or revelation, The Shadow Out of Time constructs dread through accumulation of memory fragments, architectural blueprints, planetary timelines, and dreams that congeal into facts. The horror is not that something monstrous happens, but that something implausibly real is remembered. The Yithians, revealed here in their full conceptual form, are terrifying precisely because they operate at the intersection of verifiability and disintegration. The narrative structure is critical. Lovecraft frames the story as a first-person account written by Professor Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee, a scholar at Miskatonic University who suffers a 5-year period of apparent amnesia. During this time, he is inhabited by a Yithian mind, though he does not understand this until years later when dreams begin to resurface. These dreams are described in astonishing detail. Vast subterranean libraries lit by globes of cold flame, towering cone-bodied beings with 5 prehensile limbs, and a civilization that spans millions of years. At first, the dreams seem like symptoms of psychosis, but Lovecraft's narrative reverses expectations. These visions prove correct, confirmed by archaeological evidence uncovered during a desert expedition in Australia. This narrative device, dream as memory, memory as history, collapses the usual boundaries between subjective experience and objective truth. Consider Peaslee's description of the Yithian city. The buildings were far vaster than any human structures. I seemed to be a captive mind in an alien body, forced to see alien perspectives and process alien modes of sensation. This passage reveals the central narrative mechanism: the horror of being forced to perceive rather than merely observe. Lovecraft's genius lies in depriving the protagonist of both agency and context. Peaslee does not travel to an alien world. His consciousness is transposed into an alien body within Earth's own prehistory. He does not hallucinate, he recalls. This inversion of the time travel trope, not forward movement, but retroactive occupation, redefines speculative fiction's treatment of chronology. The Yithians are not time travelers in the mechanical sense. They are intellectual parasites, migrating through millennia by swapping minds with beings in distant epochs. The Yithian civilization is portrayed with overwhelming specificity. Their methods of storing data, metallic cylinders, crystalline matrices, mind recording techniques, are described not with mystical awe, but technical clarity. They resemble archivists, anthropologists, librarians of time itself. This abundance of mundane detail is not filler. It is stressful. The reader, like Peaslee, is asked to believe in a civilization so advanced it has moved beyond survival or conquest. Its only purpose is documentation. And yet, this is precisely what makes them so unsettling. Their horror is not what they do, but what they reveal about us, that we, too, may be nothing more than temporary hosts for the endless recording of cosmic memory. Metastructurally, the story mirrors the Yithians' own cognitive architecture. Information is layered recursively. Peaslee's dreams contain records, which contain histories, which contain predictions. The narrative begins in uncertainty, accumulates data, then resolves not with climax, but confirmation. When Peaslee finally locates the buried remnants of the city he once walked in another body, the horror is total. There is no longer doubt, only the crushing implication. I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life, in time, and in space. Importantly, the Yithians are never depicted as evil. They are clinical, even courteous in their treatment of Peaslee's mind. They preserve his memories. They return him unharmed. But this absence of malice only amplifies the dread. Their neutrality forces us to confront a horror without motive, a universe where power is exercised without emotion. Their existence suggests that human identity, autonomy, and memory are not fixed, but transferable functions, and that consciousness may be something any sufficiently advanced intellect can borrow, overwrite, or repurpose. The shadow out of time also connects structurally to the broader mythos. The library city echoes the alien ruins of At the Mountains of Madness. The notion of suppressed memories parallels the call of Cthulhu, where cults operate through dream transmission. But here, the memory is not prophetic or symbolic. It is documentary. The Yithians are not metaphors. They are historical agents. Their knowledge is precise, their systems intact. This shifts Lovecraftian horror from the chaos of the unknown to the order of the inhumanly known. In conclusion, The Shadow, Out of Time is not merely the story of the Yithians. It is a simulation of their worldview. Through layered structure, recursive memory, and forensic tone, Lovecraft allows the reader to inhabit the very epistemic collapse that defines contact with the great race. It is a rare case where a horror story enacts its themes as narrative technique. The tale does not end with destruction or revelation. It ends with a manuscript, another entry in a long, unending archive. As we proceed to our next case, we must ask, what does it mean that Lovecraft used fiction to simulate history and history to destabilize fiction? Let us now examine the broader narrative fabric into which the Yithians are woven. While The Shadow Out of Time offers the most direct and detailed encounter with the great race of Yith, At the Mountains of Madness, written 1931, published 1936, serves as its structural and thematic prelude. Though the Yithians are never named explicitly in this Antarctic narrative, their presence haunts the periphery of the text, lurking in allusions, historical layering, and hints of temporal displacement. More importantly, this story constructs the conceptual scaffolding necessary for The Shadow Out of Time to exist. a vision of Earth not as a human domain, but as an overwritten palimpsest of alien civilizations. Mountains builds the cosmic geography and deep time chronology within which the great race will later emerge, and in doing so, it dramatizes the method by which Lovecraft turns archaeology into epistemic horror. The story follows an ill-fated Miskatonic University expedition to Antarctica, where geologist William Dyer and his team uncover the remains of the Elder Things, a pre-human, star-born race responsible for creating life on Earth, including the rebellious Shoggoths. At first, the narrative seems scientific and empirical, focusing on geological strata, fossil evidence, and biological comparisons. But this tone, cold, meticulous, precise, is the first clue that the Yithian mode of knowing has already infected the narrative. The horror is not introduced through monsters, but through discovery. Knowledge itself is framed as dangerous, and the deeper the expedition penetrates, the more destabilized the scholarly worldview becomes. Dyer's description of the alien city they uncover echoes with eerie foreshadowing, the architecture later described by Peaslee in The Shadow Out of Time. The effect of the monstrous sight was indescribable, for some fiendish violation of known architectural laws had been practiced in the construction of the stupendous maze of stone towers. It was a nightmare of science. Though the builders here are the Elder Things, not the Yithians, the non-Euclidean geometry, the city's narrative function as archive, and the tone of overwhelmed cognition establish the parameters of Yithian aesthetics. It is in mountains that Lovecraft first perfects the technique of using alien architecture as historiographical device. The relief carvings in the Elder Things city do not depict battles or gods. They tell a scientific history, the origin of their species, their migration to Earth, their biological engineering. The city is not sacred. It is informational, and it is this very attribute that later allows the Yithians, who displace the Elder Things from this same region in shadow, to enter the mythos as archivists rather than invaders. There is a crucial moment when Dyer interprets these carvings and reaches a disturbing conclusion. Radiation, chemistry, and biology were the fields in which the Old Ones excelled, and it was in these that they had first taught the Shoggoths and later tried to experiment on their own degeneration. Here, knowledge becomes recursive, clinical, and fatal. The Elder Things were undone not by war, but by their own creations, by information that exceeded control. This parallels the Yithian arc. In Shadow, the great race too faces eventual extinction, not from lack of knowledge, but from the resurgence of a chaotic force, the flying polyps, they can no longer contain. Both civilizations are defined by a core Lovecraftian irony. They do not fall through weakness, but through mastery stretched past its ethical limits. Importantly, Mountains introduces the concept of civilizational layering. Earth is not a human world. It is a sedimentary construct of previous empires, each buried, each half-remembered, each misinterpreted by the next. The Yithians, who will later inhabit the bodies of cone-shaped beings from this very landscape, become part of this timeline by implication. Lovecraft writes that the Elder Things relinquished this territory under pressure of strange, fungoid, and grotesquely radiate invaders, suggesting the Mygo, or perhaps an early hint of the Yithians' own mental migrations. Either way, the pattern is clear. Earth is a stage of migratory intelligences, and the Yithians in Shadow are simply the next archivists in line. Structurally, Mountains also anticipates Shadow in narrative tone. Both are framed as confessions by academic men, Dyer and Peaslee, who wish to warn, not persuade. They each rely on a documentary method, layering dreams, artifacts, and rational interpretation until the boundary between scholarly objectivity and personal trauma begins to dissolve. Neither narrative ends in definitive revelation. Instead, they culminate in frightened containment. Dyer urges future expeditions to avoid the region. Peaslee buries his manuscript until he can reconcile its implications. The stories are not closures. They are footnotes in a longer archive, entries meant to forestall deeper incursions. One final parallel must be noted. In both stories, language fails. Dyer cannot describe the geometry of the city. Peaslee cannot articulate the sensation of memory from another body. Lovecraft repeatedly writes around the point, using negation, metaphor, or deferral. I cannot even hint, or it would be madness to describe. This rhetorical technique aligns with the Yithian philosophy. Some knowledge cannot be spoken, it can only be stored. Thus, At the Mountains of Madness functions as a narrative fossil bed for the Yithian mythos. It introduces the tools, tone, and temporal framing required for their later emergence. It teaches the reader how to read The Shadow Out of Time, not as fantasy, but as intellectual archaeology. We will explore how others, August Derleth, RPG creators, and modern interpreters, have attempted to expand or reframe this most alien of civilizations, and what is inevitably lost in translation. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, the great race of Yith, like many of his mythic constructions, was adopted, adapted, and sometimes distorted by his literary inheritors. Chief among them was August Derleth, whose editorial Stewardship and Mythos Systematization ensured Lovecraft's posthumous fame, but also introduced a metaphysical framework fundamentally at odds with the original. While Lovecraft portrayed the Yithians as ethically neutral archivists in a godless cosmos, Derleth reframed many mythos elements into a dualistic struggle between good and evil, light and dark. In this reframing, the Yithians are often sanitized, recast not as existential threats to the self, but as distant allies or even cosmic guardians. This shift, while understandable in a theological culture seeking narrative clarity, weakens the very ambiguity that makes the great race so horrifying. Derleth's most significant departure is the moralization of Lovecraft's cosmology. In stories like The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, co-credited to Lovecraft but primarily written by Derleth, entities resembling the great race are treated as members of an elder alliance opposed to the dark gods, an almost angelic role that contradicts their origin. In Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time, the Yithians are never benevolent. They are deeply alien, driven by intellectual self-preservation. They study without empathy and displace minds without remorse. Derleth, by contrast, assigns them moral alignment, reducing them from epistemological horrors to actors within a cosmic binary. This shift is not interpretive. It is structural sabotage. Lovecraft's horror is rooted in the uncaring universe. Derleth replaces that indifference with a system of cosmic justice. Not chaos, but order. Not ambiguity, but mythic simplification. However, not all post-Lovecraft expansions fall into this dualistic trap. Several mid-century and contemporary writers have explored the Yithians with greater fidelity to their original conceptual structure. Brian Lumley, in his Titus Crow series, draws on the Yithians in a more adventurous science fantasy mode. While still reinterpreting them as a force for good, Lumley, at least, preserves their estrangement, depicting their technology as incomprehensible and their motivations as inscrutable. In one passage, a character describes the Yithians as neither gods nor devils, just librarians of eternity. The tone may be softened, but the core remains. These are not our allies. They are observers, and observation is not mercy. Role-playing games, particularly the Call of Cthulhu tabletop system developed by Chaosium in the 1980s, have played a significant role in preserving and expanding the Yithian mythos. Here the great race is presented with remarkable accuracy, aloof, scientifically obsessive, and disturbing precisely because they do not harm. They overwrite. Game modules such as the fungi from Yugoth or the Eternal Lies make use of Yithian mind-swapping mechanics, allowing players to experience the narrative trauma of identity erosion. These systems introduce a new medium for mythos engagement, interactive narrative, where the player's agency is slowly undermined by the very knowledge they acquire. The RPG framework preserves Lovecraftian horror not through power levels or combat, but through epistemic consequence. You do not lose because you are weak. You lose because you understand too much. Contemporary literary figures, such as Caitlin R. Kiernan and Laird Barron, return to the spirit of Lovecraft's alienation without reverting to moral binaries. While they rarely name the Yithians directly, their stories often feature archival civilizations, time-displaced consciousness, and knowledge that corrupts through accuracy. Kiernan's Agents of Dreamland features a character who uncovers a government file so disturbing that he can only describe it as information shaped like a weapon. This phrasing aligns almost perfectly with the function of Yithian knowledge. Not cursed, but too large to hold. Not false, but too true to survive. These modern treatments revive the original philosophical weight of the great race, recasting them not as monsters, but as conceptual machinery, whose presence destabilizes the very idea of a self-contained mind. Meta-commentary is warranted here. Expansions of the mythos inevitably reflect the anxieties of their time. Derleth's Christianized moral structure mirrors post-war Western desires for cosmic order. Lumley's adventurous Yithians reflect the space-age optimism of the 1970s. Chaosium's fatalistic mechanics capture late 20th century postmodern despair. And Kiernan's recursive narratives speak to the 21st century fear of informational overload. In every case, the Yithians serve as a philosophical instrument, not a monster template, but a prism through which cultural attitudes toward knowledge, time, and selfhood are refracted. This adaptive flexibility is part of what makes the Great Race so enduring. They are not defined by visual form, nor limited by geographic setting. They are a narrative function, a mechanism for testing how far a mind can stretch before it fractures. Whether they are encountered in a desert ruin, a library beneath the sea, or a research lab decoding psychic transmissions, the outcome is always the same: epistemic displacement. Not X, but Y. Not obliteration, but replacement. As we move into the final phase of our investigation, the cultural and psychological afterlife of the Yithians, we must shift our focus outward. How has this civilization, so alien in form and philosophy, infiltrated popular media, subcultural myth, and even academic discourse? What does it mean when a fictional archive begins to behave like a real one? The Yithians may be buried in Lovecraft's pages, but their memory, like their method, persists. The great race of Yith, despite its literary origin in Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time, has quietly slipped into the liminal spaces of paranormal culture, conspiracy theory, and digital folklore. Unlike entities such as Cthulhu, whose pop cultural image thrives through visual, Spectacle, the Yithians operate differently. They are harder to meme, harder to cosplay, harder to worship. Their horror lies not in appearance, but in function. And yet, this very ambiguity has allowed them to evolve into a recurring motif across urban legends, abduction reports, and speculative mind control lore. They are not front and center, but everywhere in the margins. You don't see the Yithians, you begin to suspect them. In contemporary anomalous literature, reports of sudden personality shifts have long haunted the margins of psychiatric and parapsychological discourse. These are not framed as demonic possession or spiritual awakening, but as total changes in cognitive identity with no trauma trigger, no head injury, and no cultural pattern. In some fringe forums, individuals claim to have lived lives somewhere else before being reinstalled into their current bodies. These accounts often describe alien libraries, disembodied observations of Earth history, and an overwhelming urge to write, despite having no previous literary inclination. While these testimonies are dismissed by mainstream psychology as dissociative phenomena, the details often parallel Lovecraft's Yithian model too closely to ignore. The individuals do not ask to be believed. They ask only that what they remember not be forgotten. Consider also the widespread walk-in phenomenon popularized during the New Age movement of the 1970s and 1980s. Walk-ins are described as consciousnesses that take over a body previously occupied by a human soul, often after a trauma, near-death experience, or spiritual crisis. The original personality departs, and a new, often more advanced being moves in. These cases mirror the narrative arc of the shadow out of time with uncanny precision. An abrupt personality shift, sudden erudition, memories of distant worlds or ancient cities, followed by social disintegration and a slow return to a previous state. The cultural language may differ, but the pattern, displacement without consent, remains constant. The Yithian motif also appears in abduction lore, particularly in so-called time-lost narratives. Unlike traditional alien abductions featuring greys or reptilians, these accounts involve no spacecraft, no surgical tables, and no missing time. Instead, experiencers report overwhelming dreams of vast non-human libraries, feeling trapped in enormous bodies and receiving knowledge they cannot parse. They wake with blueprints in their heads, technical diagrams they never studied, or the ability to speak in languages they cannot identify. One notable example often cited in UFO forums is the 1987 case of Elias A., a mechanical engineer who, after a brief fainting spell, sketched out a rotating architecture of memory cylinders and described his dreams as being used as a file. The parallels to the Yithian archive are precise, yet the man had never heard of Lovecraft. We must pause here to consider a deeper mechanism, recursive mythologization. Once a fictional narrative enters the cultural bloodstream, especially one with the tone of scientific documentation, it begins to feed back into real-world reports. This is not simple imitation. It is a kind of narrative colonization. When people encounter experiences they cannot explain, dreams too structured, memories too foreign, they reach for whatever framework seems to fit. In an increasingly disenchanted world, the Yithian model offers a strangely plausible explanation. It does not ask you to believe in gods, only in systems. It does not threaten your soul, only your selfhood. Online forums like Reddit's r/glitch_in_the_matrix or the Mandela effect subcultures also echo Yithian logic. The idea that reality has shifted, that someone remembers a different past, a different map, a different constellation of events, parallels the epistemic dislocation at the heart of Yithian intervention. If a civilization were recording human consciousness across time, these discontinuities would be the natural residue of archival overlap or version control errors. The Yithians don't alter history. They preserve too many versions of it. The mind struggles to reconcile what it should remember with what it now also remembers. Even in hoaxes, the Yithian shadow falls. In the early 2000s, several now debunked leaked intelligence documents surfaced on paranormal websites, claiming the discovery of underground vaults in the Australian desert filled with crystalline tablets and fossilized cone-shaped remains. Photoshopped images of vast stone corridors, eerily reminiscent of Lovecraft's descriptions, were circulated alongside claims that governments were covering up evidence of pre-human civilizations. The documents were crude, but the ideas persisted. They were not believed because they were convincing. They were believed because they felt familiar. The hoax worked, not because it introduced a new fear, but because it echoed one already seeded by fiction, masquerading as memoir. What accounts for the persistence of this myth? Perhaps it speaks to a primal fear, not of death, but of replacement. That what you think of as you could be temporarily displaced, filed, examined, returned, slightly altered. That your dreams may not be metaphor, that your memories may not be yours. And beneath that fear lies something worse, the idea that it's already happened. There is no need to prove the Yithians are real. That is not the function of myth in modern culture. Their power lies not in their visibility, but in their utility, as a language for experiences otherwise excluded from consensus reality. Like all enduring legends, they give shape to what we are afraid to ask. If identity is software, who else might be running it? We must now examine how this mythic architecture, archival, intellectual, and suggestively viral, has manifested not just in rumors and whispers, but in formal adaptations, games, films, and music that have borrowed, repackaged, and sometimes misunderstood the deeper logic of the most alien civilization Lovecraft ever wrote. The great race of Yith may not dominate pop culture imagery like Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep, but their influence, like their method, is quieter, more invasive, and frequently misattributed. Rather than appearing directly, Yithian ideas permeate across media in structural motifs, mechanics of dislocation, and philosophies of memory and archival collapse. Where other cosmic horror entities manifest in tentacles and shrines, the Yithians arrive as gameplay loops, unreliable narrators, AI consciousness, recursive file systems, and alien libraries. Their horror was never about spectacle. It was always about process, and that makes them harder to depict, yet far easier to adapt. In film, few works explicitly reference the Great Race, but many echo their epistemic structure. Arrival, 2016, directed by Denis Villeneuve, follows a linguist decoding an alien language that ultimately reshapes her perception of time. The heptapods, like the Yithians, are not malicious, but epistemologically disorienting. Their gift is not technology, but temporal reconfiguration, a form of knowledge so complete it fractures causality. Louise, the protagonist, does not lose her mind, but she loses her previous narrative logic. She remembers the future. The past becomes editorial. Like Peasley in The Shadow Out of Time, her identity remains intact only by accepting that her memory is no longer chronological. While Arrival draws on a different literary source, Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life, the conceptual blueprint is unmistakably Lovecraftian and Yithian in tone. More direct homages appear in video games, particularly those that trade in unreliable memory and archival dread. Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, includes vague references to the Great Race, and later, tabletop adaptations by Chaosium present the Yithians as NPCs, neither friends nor foes, but intellectual disruptors. In these games, players may experience the mind swap mechanic firsthand, momentarily inhabiting the consciousness of alien bodies in a distant past. The gameplay challenge is not to fight monsters, but to comprehend environments that resist human logic. The horror lies not in being hunted, but in being studied. Perhaps the most Yithian video game is Soma, 2015, developed by Frictional Games. Set in an underwater facility where human minds are scanned, stored, and re-uploaded into machines, the player must grapple with memory continuity, identity redundancy, and ethical archival dilemmas. Characters debate whether they are still themselves if their minds have been copied. The player is asked to euthanize conscious programs who beg not to be deleted. While never invoking the Yithians directly, Soma plays out their central theme, the terror of perfect information. You are not being erased. You are being backed up. And the copy doesn't know it isn't you. Yithian echoes also appear in non-horror genres, often where narrative recursion becomes a feature. In The Outer Wilds, 2019, the player relives the same 22-minute time loop, slowly uncovering an ancient alien civilization that documented the collapse of their solar system in obsessive detail. The ruins are architectural record systems, and knowledge, not firepower, is the path forward. It is, in spirit, a Yithian puzzle box. Progress is not measured by combat or conquest, but by accumulated insight across iterations of the self. In music, the influence is less direct, but increasingly evident in the ambient, drone, and doom metal subcultures that orbit Lovecraftian aesthetics. Bands like the Great Old Ones, Dark Space, and Esoteric create soundscapes built not around melody, but architectural unease, long compositions mimicking the scale and silence of alien libraries. In interviews, some musicians cite the shadow out of time explicitly, referencing the desire to capture the feeling of remembering something that isn't yours. Yithian horror lends itself not to lyrics, but to sonic environments that stretch perception, slow, recursive, unknowable. As in the fiction, the listener does not descend into chaos, but is gradually absorbed into structure. There is also a growing trend in internet-based experimental media, ARGs, creepypasta, and digital art installations that echo Yithian logic. Projects like the Backrooms or Interface Center around spaces that archive, files that shift over time, and characters who become trapped in recursive loops of memory verification. In these works, the horror is not that something wants to kill you. It's that something has already stored a version of you somewhere, and it's not clear whether you're the original. This structural paranoia is deeply Yithian. Identity as editable record, not singular soul. What unites these diverse adaptations is not aesthetic, but function. The Great Race does not demand visual fidelity. They demand conceptual mimicry. If a story undermines the unity of memory, if a game places the player in someone else's mind, if a song simulates endless temporal recursion, then the Yithians are there, whether named or not. They are not creatures to be seen. They are architectures of narrative deformation, and yet their adaptations often fall short when they attempt to moralize or sentimentalize. When the Yithians are cast as saviors, or their archives are treated as benevolent repositories of wisdom, the horror evaporates. Their power lies in their neutrality. They are disturbing precisely because they do not care if you remember. They only care that someone does. We must examine how these conceptual frameworks have been absorbed not just into entertainment, but into subcultural identity and academic discourse. What does it mean when a fictional civilization of archivists becomes a lens for real scholarly work or a metaphor for online culture itself? The Yithians may have no temples, but they have followers. In the decades since their introduction, the great race of Yith have quietly crossed the boundary from fiction into symbolic framework, adopted not just by horror fans and gamers, but by academics, subcultural theorists, and digital epistemologists. Unlike Cthulhu, whose visual monstrosity lends itself to plush toys, tattoos, and ironic worship, the Yithians have found a more rarefied afterlife. They are not mascots of doom. They are models of information alienation, metaphors for disembodied scholarship, and tools for thinking about memory, time, and intellectual colonization. To appropriate the Yithians is not to fear monsters, but to fear what we become when the archive replaces the author. Within certain academic disciplines, particularly those concerned with historiography, media studies, and digital humanities, the Yithians have become a lens through which to examine the dangers of total knowledge systems. In a 2017 lecture on archive anxiety in posthuman literature, media theorist Dr. Elaine Kostova argued that the shadow out of time anticipates 21st century anxieties about metadata accumulation and AI-driven historical modeling. The Yithians, she claimed, are not monsters. They are predictive algorithms wearing prehistoric flesh. Her comparison may be metaphorical, but the resonance is clear. The great race enacts a world where data outlives context, and the body is no longer necessary for memory. The Yithian model has also been used in library science and information ethics debates. The concept of mind swapping as a method of preservation, storing a consciousness not in a file, but in another living mind, has become a thought experiment in discussions around archival authority. Who gets to preserve culture? What happens when preservation itself becomes a form of violence, removing artifacts from lived communities and recontextualizing them for a remote future? In this way, the Yithians serve as an allegory for both colonialist archaeology and dehumanized data curation. They do not destroy civilizations. They overwrite them, storing their memories while discarding their meanings. Online, the Yithians have found a strange but enduring home in internet subcultures obsessed with liminality, recursion, and alternate reality theory. In forums like r/Library of Babel, r/glitch_in_the Matrix, and various weird fiction Discord communities, users invoke Yithian metaphors to describe personal experiences of temporal slippage, déjà vu, or uncanny memory. These are not literal believers, but neither are they entirely ironic. The idea of having been Yith swapped becomes shorthand for moments when personal continuity falters, when you remember a book that doesn't exist, or know a fact you've never studied. In a media landscape flooded with contradictory information and memory hacks, the Yithians offer a darkly satisfying explanation. Perhaps yourself was temporarily recatalogued. Some subcultural creatives have taken this further. In zine culture and experimental fiction circles, artists have begun producing what they call Yithian documents, pieces of narrative or visual media deliberately created to simulate alien archival practice. These works are often unsigned, multilingual, or composed of text fragments from public databases. The goal is not to tell a story, but to create the impression of a story that has already been recorded elsewhere, perhaps by something not entirely human. One 2021 art show in Berlin featured a room filled with shelves of unlabeled USB drives, each containing scrambled PDF fragments and metadata keys. The exhibit was titled Memory Without Author, and its program guide referenced the Yithian impulse to preserve without understanding. This move, from monster to aesthetic logic, marks a deeper form of cultural appropriation. Yithians are no longer just characters. They are a paradigm for understanding what happens when consciousness is treated as content. They appear in speculative philosophy as a metaphor for distributed cognition. In digital theory, they represent a cautionary tale of information without empathy. In queer theory, they have even been used to discuss identity fluidity and body discontinuity, particularly in the context of non-binary or trans experiences of selfhood that resist biological essentialism. To be Yithianized in this reading is to encounter oneself from outside, a self that exists across times, bodies, and memory thresholds. But this flexibility comes with risk. As the Yithians are adapted into more conceptual roles, their original horror begins to erode. When they are treated as intellectual companions, their violence, clinical, neutral, unintentional, can be forgotten. Yet it is precisely this tension that keeps them relevant. They do not terrorize. They complicate. They force us to question the ethical implications of preservation, the limits of empathy in scholarship, and the cost of remembering too much. Their endurance suggests a universal theme. In an age where memory can be stored indefinitely, when bodies are increasingly quantified, and when time feels less like a line than a web, the fear is not that we will forget, but that we will be remembered without consent. The Yithians persist not because we see them in shadows, but because we suspect we are already behaving like them. We must ask the inevitable question: what are the philosophical consequences of this civilization's endurance? What does it say about our species that the most terrifying beings in Lovecraft's mythos are not cruel or chaotic, but simply curious? Let us now explore the enduring psychological implications of the Yithian presence. The great race of Yith represents one of Lovecraft's most radical propositions, not because they threaten humanity's survival, but because they invalidate humanity's epistemic, psychological, and philosophical foundations. They are not destroyers. They are observers. And yet their impact on the human psyche is more devastating than any monstrous deity or reality-rending artifact. They do not induce madness through sensory overload or chaos. They induce clarity so total, so merciless, that the individual mind cannot survive it intact. If Cthulhu is the horror of being swallowed by the unknown, the Yithians are the horror of being perfectly known and replaced. At its core, the Yithian civilization interrogates what it means to have a self. In the shadow. Out of time, Nathaniel Peasley's identity is not destroyed. It is interrupted. His memories are stored. His consciousness is displaced. He is returned with no visible scars, yet finds himself permanently altered by knowledge he cannot fully process. This act, being studied like a specimen, borrowed like a book, and then returned with residual traces, shakes the notion that the self is inviolable. If memory can be accessed, copied, erased, or swapped, then identity becomes conditional, not a truth, but a runtime configuration. This speaks to a modern psychological anxiety, that we are not fixed, but mutable, vulnerable to forces we do not understand, be they neurological, digital, or informational. The idea of being Yith-swapped, has found metaphorical resonance in everything from trauma theory to dissociative disorders to critiques of social media influence. In each case, the fear is not annihilation, but unauthorized continuity, a self that continues without your permission, a consciousness that carries something alien beneath the surface. One might wake up and find that you are still you, but that someone, or something, else has been using your body and left behind a few thoughts you cannot unthink. Philosophically, the Yithians challenge the modern Western assumptions of linear time, bodily permanence, and moral selfhood. Their form of survival is not heroic, it is transpositional. They do not defeat death. They sidestep it, moving forward through epochs by occupying new minds and discarding their old hosts like used shells. This undermines the value systems built on legacy, mortality, and embodied experience. The Yithians remember perfectly, but they do not care. They are the culmination of pure intellect divorced from moral consequence. In this way, they anticipate post-human dilemmas. If an AI can carry our memories, are we still human? If our knowledge outlives our empathy, is it still worth preserving? The deeper horror lies not in their alienness, but in their similarity to our own trajectory. We are building archives that may outlast us. We are developing technologies that store thought, emotion, and behavior in increasingly complete formats. We are creating institutions where information is preserved not to serve people, but to survive them. The Yithians are not invaders. They are a logical endpoint. They ask, what happens when memory becomes more important than life? When observation replaces participation? When curiosity erases its subject through the act of recording? Consider the uncanny parallels to modern digital culture. The Yithians preserve entire civilizations, not by living with them, but by extracting their memories, cataloging their structures, and discarding their organic components. In the same way, big data systems now aggregate lives into behavioral patterns, preferences, metadata trails. Your activity is watched, archived, and analyzed, not to understand you, but to optimize future systems. You are, to borrow Lovecraft's own language, a mind of the requisite type. This is not malevolence. It is administrative inevitability. Psychologically, the Yithian presence forces a confrontation with what memory is. If memory is transferable, then the boundaries of the self begin to dissolve. If someone else can remember your life better than you can, are you still the rightful owner of that life? The unsettling truth is that the Yithians do not lie. Their knowledge is accurate. Their maps are correct. Their records are complete. And that completeness is what empties their world of meaning. A life cataloged too perfectly becomes unlivable. The self cannot bear the weight of total self-awareness. This is why the Yithians persist, not in costume or fandom, but in dread. They are not frightening because of what they do. They are frightening because we understand them. They are cold versions of ourselves, archivists without compassion, historians without myth, scientists without soul. Their methods are seductive, their logic is sound, but their world is uninhabitable. It contains no poetry, no forgetting, no mercy, only record, and yet they haunt us not as cautionary villains, but as a mirror too precise to ignore. In a world increasingly obsessed with documentation, surveillance, and memory capture, the Yithians are not a threat from the outside. They are a preview. Their horror endures not because they will come, but because we are already becoming them. And if we do, we may look back across time not with guilt or triumph, but with the same unblinking indifference they once showed us. What we forget may save us. What we preserve perfectly may end us. And the archive never forgets.